Back in 2018, you might remember hearing about the massive floods in Kerala, India. They called it a once-in-a-century disaster. But was it? That's what we're going to dig into today. We're going to look at the evidence and ask a pretty tough question. Were these killer floods just a freak act of nature, or were they something predictable, something man-made? So here's the thing. The rains in 2018, they didn't just bring water. They brought the mountains down with them. Get this, the National Remote Sensing Center counted 5,191 landslides in a single year, tearing through the Western Ghats. I mean, think about that. This wasn't just a flood, This was the land itself just collapsing. And that brings us right back to our big question. Was this just a case of terrible weather, an act of God? Or did we humans have something to do with it? To figure that out, we've got to look at the clues, the ones carved into the earth and the ones written down on paper. All right, first up, let's get our boots on the ground, so to speak. We're going to look at the mountains themselves. What was going on with the land that made it so fragile, so ready to just give way when the rains hit? So the setting for this whole story is the Western Ghats, and this place, it's absolutely stunning. It's not just beautiful, it's incredibly important ecologically. I mean, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that's actually older than the Himalayas. Think about that. It's the lifeblood of Kerala. It provides the water, shapes the climate, and holds all this incredible biodiversity. But for all that ancient history and natural beauty, a very different kind of story has been carved into its slopes lately. It's a story of, well, taking things out of the ground. A story of changing the very shape of the land, and it's been happening on a massive scale. And a huge piece of that puzzle, quarrying. We're talking about quarries of granite. Research from the Kerala Forest Research Institute found there are almost 6,000 of them operating in the state. 5,924 to be exact. To put that in perspective, that's like an average of 6 quarries for every single local community government. But it's not just the number of quarries that matters, it's where they are, and this is the really critical part. That same research, it found that a whopping 56% of them, more than half, are in areas officially labeled as ecologically fragile. These are the absolute weakest spots, the places you'd least want to be digging into, the ones most likely to crumble. Okay, so here's where we connect the dots. An analysis after the disaster looked at the 11 worst landslide areas, and in 10 of them, 10 out of 11, there were active granite quarries. And here's the real kicker. They were operating in zones that expert reports had already flagged, saying, hey, you absolutely should not be mining or quarrying here. These areas need to be protected. So this wasn't some big secret. The danger was out there, it was known, which brings us to the next part of this story. We're going to shift our focus from the physical scars on the mountains to the warnings that were written down on paper and then, completely ignored. So the whole future of the Western Ghats basically boiled down to this showdown between two different reports. First, you had the Gadgil report back in 2011. This thing was serious. It called for strong, comprehensive protection, a flat-out ban on new quarries in the most fragile zones, and, this is key, it wanted local communities to have a say in their own conservation plans. But that was seen as way too strict. So another committee was put together, the Koster and Gangan panel. And their report? It recommended protecting a much smaller area and basically watering down all the restrictions. And you can probably guess which one got sidelined. The stronger Gadgil report? It never really saw the light of day. It was hit with these massive public protests. You had people out on the streets, and a lot of it was fueled by misinformation and this very real, very deep fear that any kind of conservation plan was just a sneaky way to kick them off the land their families had lived on and worked for generations. And when you lay out the timeline, it's just tragic. Check this out. 2011, the big warning is published. By 2013, because of all the protests, the report is pretty much dead in the water. Then, just 5 years later, 2018, the disaster they warned about happens. It's kind of hard to see that as a coincidence, right? But we have to ask the question, why? Why were people so angry and scared about these warnings? To really get that, we need to peel back another layer of this story. We have to go back in time and look at the very human roots of this whole conflict. Okay, a really important piece of this whole thing is something called the high-range colonization scheme. Basically, starting back in the 1950s, the government had this plan. They encouraged thousands of families who had no land and very little money to move up into the mountains of the Western Ghats. The deal was, You get 5 acres of forest, and you can clear it, grow food, and build a new life for your family. And you can imagine this created this incredibly deep personal bond with the land. You have people like Mariama, who moved there when she was young. To her, this wasn't just some plot of land. It was, and I'm quoting her here, my home, the world Achian and I so painstakingly built. So when you're a settler and you hear people talking about conservation, it doesn't sound like saving trees. It sounds like someone threatening to take away everything you've ever built. But, and this is a huge but, there's another side to this story of hardship and building a new life. Because the land that those settlers were told to clear, it wasn't empty. And this is where we hear from Raman Raja Menon, who is the king of the indigenous Manon tribe. From his perspective, the story is completely different. He talks about how his people lost everything, their ancestral lands, as waves of settlers came in, backed by the government. They got little to nothing for it. For them, this wasn't a story of brave pioneers. It was a story of being pushed out, of being duped. So what you end up with is this incredibly complicated and painful situation. On one hand, you have the settlers, who've been there for generations and are terrified of losing their homes and their way of life. And on the other, you have the Adivasi, the tribal communities, who are already displaced from that very same land. And this conflict, this unresolved history, it's the backdrop for absolutely everything that came next. Okay, so let's tie all of these threads together, right? You've got the scarred landscape from the quarrying, you've got the expert warnings that were ignored, and you have this really deep historical human conflict. And they all lead to one place, 2018, the year the mountains just couldn't take anymore. So when you lay it all out like that, the 2018 floods, they stop looking like some random freak event, don't they? They start to look almost inevitable, like the tragic but logical conclusion to decades of carving up fragile hillsides, of ignoring experts who are screaming about the danger, and of never really dealing with the painful history of the people who live there. You know, there's actually a sign near the Idiki Dam that reads, "Tell the saga of Idiki to your kids." And when you think about it, what a saga that is. As we've seen, it's a story of migration and building new lives, sure, but it's also a story of destruction, of people being pushed aside, and of warnings. Warnings that were heard, but not listened to. And really, that leaves all of us with a huge question. And it's not just for Kerala, it's for everywhere. When the land itself starts sending us these clear signals, when it's telling us it has reached a breaking point, how do we possibly balance the idea of progress with the very real, very high cost of survival?